David Simister's Live on Cars.
I've been lucky enough to drive all sorts of cars in my short time as a motoring journalist, but I'd like to begin tonight, if I may, with just one. The Mazda MX-5 is not just a brilliant car, but the one machine which symbolises everything I love about motoring. If anybody ever asked me what it is that makes being a petrolhead so much fun, I'd throw them the keys to one of these, point them in the direction of a really good road, and wait for them to come back with an enormous smile stretching right across their face. It's not just fabulously good looking, great fun to drive and cheap to buy and run, but unlike all the British sports cars I was brought up lusting after, this one actually works properly too. It means that enjoying your motoring isn't going to be ruined by making a phone call to the RAC. Since its introduction more than 20 years ago, more than 500,000 people have got into an MX-5 and loved every minute of it. And it was 2 summers ago that I was lucky enough to get into one and discover why it was so much more entertaining than a BMW Z4 or a Mercedes SLK, both of which are also two-seater sports cars, but neither of which are even remotely as entertaining. I had to put my money where my mouth was. I just had to have one. This, after more than a year of scrimping and saving, was what I bought. It's one of the early models, which I actually bought after finding in the classified ads in The Champion, the weekly newspaper I write for. It was like Christmas had come early. I had, finally, one of the best balanced sports cars ever made, and it wasn't one that had to go back to a car maker's press office. It was mine! That's why the first thing I did was got in it, pointed its pop-up headlights north, and headed to the wonderful roads which crisscross the Lake District. Nothing, of course, could go wrong. Unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, when it did go wrong, it happened in style. It was on the A6, somewhere north of Shap, that the little sports car's rear end snapped out of line, and what you see here is the result. It was not only embarrassing and hugely expensive to put right, but it taught me a valuable lesson. The conditions I already knew were far from brilliant, and, as it turned out later, the tyres, particularly the back ones, which had to deal with all that power, were far from ideal either. But it was this incident, and the shock of discovering that my driving probably wasn't as sharply honed as I'd like to think it was, that brought me to the Institute of Advanced Motorists. In a small way, it's why you're watching this presentation, but I'll come back to that one later. In 2003, I was just like every other 17-year-old, ballsy, opinionated, and itching to get my driving licence, which is why in that year I belted up and got onto the road for the very first time in a driving instructor's Renault Clio, not a million miles away from the one you're looking at now. Yet what frustrated me was that when I eventually got to the driving test centre, my best efforts behind the wheel didn't get me a pass. Nor, as it turned out, did my next attempt, nor did the one after that. In fact, thanks to a combination of going to university, having a string of not very good instructors, and just letting the nerves get the better of me, it took me 5 years and as many attempts to actually get through the test. It might surprise you that someone who's as openly keen as their cars as I am actually took as long as they did to get through the test, but I really do have to admit that I struggled. As much as I'd like to think I'm a good driver, all a petrolhead has to do in an argument is just ask me how many times it took me to pass my test. It was, in fact, a member of Sefton's Institute of Advanced Motorists, a driving instructor based in Ainsdale, who finally got me through the test in 2008 by teaching me an important bit of driving psychology that I still swear by today. You cannot deal with the things on the road that you've already driven past, and nor can you tackle things that you haven't happened yet. Deal with what you can see, for as far as you can see, to the best of your ability. I haven't looked back since. In fact, it's thanks to his efforts that after 5 years of waiting, I was finally in a position to pay an extortionate amount of car insurance, rip those L plates off, and take to the roads in a car of my choice. Naturally, the sensible thing to do would have been to pick a second-hand Clio, a molly-cuddled Nissan Micra or a Fiesta not a million miles away from the one that I actually passed in, but because I'm not very sensible, I went for a Mini instead. Specifically, one that had spent the previous 15 years hidden away in people's garages, and one that had only scraped through an MOT earlier on thanks to some automotive form of divine invention. But my 1983 Mayfair, for all her many, many, many faults, was mine. I called her Alex. At that time, I was 6 months into working for my first job as a journalist for a weekly newspaper called the North Wales Weekly News. And for the first 6 months of motoring, I nursed the ancient Mini between my parents' place in Southport and the newspaper's offices just outside Llandudno. Sometimes I'd make it, and with it being an old Mini, sometimes I wouldn't. It was, in its own little way, a car you could rely on. In that, what I mean is that you could rely on it to conk out on the A59, which it did on several occasions. Alex was a little car with all sorts of problems, but I absolutely loved it to bits. Even though I threw in the towel and sold it to a Mini enthusiast in Skem 2 years ago, thanks to her being pictured next to me on a weekly basis in the Champion, she's still the one car that I'm associated with when people come up to me. By the time I picked up my driving licence and my first car, I'd already graduated from university with a journalism degree and got my first job as a reporter, but it would take another couple of months until I got, by almost quirk of fate, my first gig of actually writing about motoring. One of the editors of the Daily Post, produced in the same offices as the Weekly News, had noticed me boring other journalists with my automated ramblings and asked me if I'd be prepared to help out with a motoring theme page for each Friday's edition of the Welsh paper. It was, even he admitted, a bit of thinly veiled advertorial to encourage the big car dealer groups to buy a bit more advertising, but I was more than happy to take up the challenge. That's how I ended up swapping the keys for the Mini for the rather more sophisticated key fob for a Toyota IQ, which is a sort of smart car that the Japanese car maker had introduced at the time, and had just gone on sale at the company's showroom in Llandudno. It's weird how one of my first test drives of a car is in a model that I still reckon is a bit of a cracker today. A little bit on the expensive side perhaps, but packed with clever ideas in a surprisingly short amount of space. I gave the car a glowing write-up in the following Friday's edition, but just to make sure it wasn't the excitement of testing new cars for the first time, I actually borrowed one over a year later and test drove it again just to be sure. Luckily, it was still brilliant the second time around. While I was at the Daily Post, I drove all sorts of different cars, including cheap and cheerful ones like the Ford Ka, flashier ones like the Mini Cooper, and even openly exotic stuff for a young reporter like the newly introduced BMW Z4. It was only when I got around to test driving the Volkswagen Scirocco later that year that I learned my first lesson about road testing cars. If there's a local dealership involved, choose your words very carefully. The irony was that I liked that car a lot. Of the coupes that you can currently buy, if you like your driving, I'd still go for a Scirocco even now, but the salespeople weren't exactly over the moon when I pointed out that it wasn't as roomy as a Golf, which offers the same sort of thrills in a more practical package, or as pretty as either an Alfa Romeo Brera or an Audi TT. So how do you keep the car dealers happy while being honest, in fact, come to think of it, being blunt, with your readers? There is a way around it, of course, but it'd take me another couple of months again before I cracked that one. A lot of people seem to think that I write just about cars, which admittedly is my passion in life, but I am a fully trained reporter, just one who came into the world of local newspapers just as it was facing one of its biggest ever upheavals. As the noughties drew to a close, Trinity Mirror, the owner of both the Weekly News and the Daily Post, was struggling. It might have been the biggest newspaper company in the country, but it was being hammered by both the internet and the effects of the credit crunch, and even though I was only a newly trained reporter, I could definitely feel the effects over in North Wales. That's why when somebody in a pub came over to me one night and handed me a job advert for the Champion, I went for the opportunity. Life on Cars began as a blog shortly after I moved back to Southport because I was keen to keep my toes in the water of motoring journalism, but my job was, and still is, to report what was going on in West Lancashire for the Champion's thousands of readers in that particular borough. If you love your cars, then there's always something going on, so I thought it'd be a good idea to let people know what I thought, even if it was only in a small way confined to an internet blog at first. The first column in the Champion sort of happened by accident when one of our editions in September 2009, with only a few hours to go before deadline, had no copy at all in the motoring pages. I'd just been to a banger race up in Carnforth the previous weekend and written an article for my blog about it, and it went in, and luckily the readers really liked it. From then on, Life on Cars was a weekly feature in the Champion which went through thousands of letterboxes, and I'm absolutely humbled by the following it's attracted since. I even got a go at test driving a couple more cars, including the Mazda 3, the Honda Jazz and the Ford Galaxy, but with a free newspaper that depends entirely on advertising for revenue, the problems I'd encountered in North Wales about dealerships became even more apparent. I almost gave up entirely until somebody suggested a way around it. Don't approach the dealers, but the manufacturers themselves. Most of the companies told me that they'd rather deal with Auto Express and What Car than a weekly newspaper, but eventually somebody from Peugeot's press office obliged and actually agreed to lend me a car. That's probably why I went to the effort I did with that write-up. Rather than just any old car review, I took a leaf out of Top Gear's book and put it up against a train in a race for a feature in Great Life, which is a lifestyle magazine made by the Champion. The car, a Peugeot 207cc, was good, if not earth-shatteringly amazing, but it was one of the more memorable drives that I did because it was tasked with getting me from Settle to Carlisle faster than the Settle to Carlisle train could. Without breaking any laws, I managed to pull up in the car park outside Carlisle's historic train station 11 minutes before the train from Yorkshire did. This is the Millbrook Proving Ground in Bedfordshire, the fastest test circuit in the UK. It's where Tiff Needell managed to average 195 miles an hour in a McLaren F1, and it's also where companies from across the world come to test all sorts of different vehicles. And once a year, it's where journalists from across the country are invited to put all sorts of new cars through their paces. For the last 2 years, I've been one of those journalists. Remember the Toyota IQ that I was talking about earlier? Well, this is where I managed to not only get behind the wheel for a second time, but actually managed to max it on the test track's high-speed banking. I rocketed round at over 100 miles an hour and managed to get quite a few surprise looks as I went round. I also got to go in the very first Range Rover ever made, which despite having been made in Land Rover's factory way back in 1969 was still in very good condition. And I also got to drive the Honda CRZ, one of my all-time favourites, for the first time. Millbrook is big fun if you love motoring, but there is a serious point to it all. It meant that I could drive lots of different cars from different manufacturers without having to either upset a car dealer or beg a press office to lend me one, and it made all the difference to putting meaningful, honest road tests in the Champion on a regular basis. There are 2 test drives every year, one at Millbrook and one at the Wetherby Racecourse in North Yorkshire, and because I usually get to drive 15 or 16 cars at each, it means there's enough write-ups to keep the Champion motoring pages going for most weeks of the year. It's a rotten job, but someone's got to do it. The big question quite a few people have asked me though is, how? Is there an art to reviewing cars? Can anybody do it? And how would you actually get to the point where you're lucky enough to get paid for it? While I'll freely admit that I'd like to write about cars full-time for a living, I can offer a few tips for anyone who might be in the room. You might be a naturally gifted writer with a flair for memorable phrases about motoring, but you'll have a job on your hands trying to convince an editor to give you a shot unless you can actually prove you've got the basic skills of reporting under your belt. You have to love writing, and when I say love it, I mean really love it, to the point where you find yourself knocking thousands of words into a keyboard strangely therapeutic. And you have to love it even more than motoring itself. I'm sorry, but it's true. Arguably, he's the best motoring journalist in the world, but there is only one Jeremy Clarkson, and trying to imitate his phrases, views and tastes is going to get you nowhere. For what it's worth, I actually think the best writer on Top Gear is James May, who managed to survive being sacked as sub-editor at Autocar and make it onto the world's biggest car show because his observations on motoring are funny, relevant and uniquely his. The best writers, I find, develop and hone their own style over many years and with a lot of practice. One thing that I have learned from the world of local newspapers is that the ones who can adapt and call on several skills at a time are the ones who get ahead. You might not be a naturally gifted photographer, but if you're able to use a camera as well as write engaging copy, you're even more attractive to a publishing company. You'd think, given that I work for a printed newspaper, that I'd naturally have a downer on the internet, but I actually absolutely love it, and reckon that all writers in this day and age should. Life on Cars started as an internet blog, and I know from the following it gets that going online is the easiest, cheapest way to reach a large, diverse audience. Not that it's the be-all and end-all, of course. You're not writing about cars for your own amusement, but for other people, so it's important to know and understand who your audience is. I'm lucky that I can say I can understand the region's petrol heads because I'm one of them, but the reader of, say, classic and sports car is a completely different animal to the people who enjoy Top Gear. It's important to appreciate the difference between the two. It's always embarrassing to get something wrong in a review, and because nobody's perfect, I know that feeling all too well, but it's much worse to deliberately mislead someone with what you write. I would much rather upset a car company or a dealership by telling it like it is than by giving every car a 5-star review, because otherwise the write-ups would just have no value. Don't exaggerate your observations for effect either. Readers aren't stupid, and they will desert you if you aren't giving them the warts and all treatment they deserve. It sounds obvious, but it's harder than you think. Hopefully none of you are snoring away at the back at the moment. The rule of thumb I got taught is that if you're getting bored writing something, then the people at the other end are definitely going to be bored reading it. Luckily, nobody has asked me to explain how carburettor works yet, so luckily I've managed to steer clear of sending people to sleep yet. Lamborghini reviews are for 6-year-olds. Chances are, if you're going to be reviewing cars, you're far more likely to be asked for your thoughts on, say, the Skoda Yeti. It's not a car that is going to appear on your son's bedroom wall anytime soon, but it is a very good car for all sorts of reasons. Why? Well, I'll come back to that a bit later on. This is the MG Metro 6R4, which I accidentally wrote in a piece earlier this year had a V8 engine in the back. It does of course have a V6 engine in the back, and quite a few readers noticed. In that case, it was a typo, but it does highlight how important it is to get your facts right and to check them. I actually have a reader who writes to me every time I misuse an apostrophe, and I'm not making that up, so getting a fact wrong, frankly, would be unforgivable in his book. I love looking at cars very nearly as much as I enjoy driving them, which is why I've always been keen to give classic car shows a few column inches wherever I can. For as long as I can remember, my weekends have been spent wandering around fields in the countryside, cooing at Austin Healey's, taking photos of Triumph TR4s, and wondering whether I'll ever be able to afford some of the prices plastered across the windscreens of the old Jags, Astons and Ferraris up for sale. I've always argued that motoring should be a broad church for petrolheads of every background, but classic car fans must make up some of its largest and most loyal denominations. Every Sunday, somewhere in the countryside will play host to a pilgrimage where enthusiasts revel in the delicate lines of an older car. With so many of them bringing their kids along for the ride, you get the sense that it's a passion that will get passed down through the generations, with the cars themselves becoming more like treasure heirlooms than machines to get you from A to B. Most weekends each summer I'm there too, taking photos and writing down my reflections on the events for other car enthusiasts to enjoy. For years, the show to remember has always been the Woodvale Rally, with acre after acre of old cars to immerse yourself in. But in recent years, there's also been the Northwest Indoor Show, the classic car shows at Tatton Hall, the Bank Hall show in Bretherton, and one that I've been very closely involved in, the Ormskirk Motorfest. I realised pretty early on though that I'm better off actually going to these events and reviewing them than organising them. The one time I tried 2 years ago didn't go very well. I'd teamed up with the organisers of a community cinema in Parbold and persuaded them to put on a showing of The Italian Job, and in return I'd bring them a gaggle of old minis to help boost the audience numbers for that night's showing. I'd organised everything down to the last detail, but Alex, my little mini, had other ideas. The twisty road between Formby and Down Holland was where I was bumbling along at 40 miles an hour, and Alex decided she'd have enough of being a four-wheel car and would much rather be a Reliant Robin instead. As I braked for a sharp left-hander, there was an almighty bang, and the whole car leaned to one side, followed by several seconds of an almighty scraping sound as she slid very loudly to a halt. What you see here is the result, and even though I miraculously still managed to get to the cinema on time that night, my Mini had let me down in spectacular style. It was, as always, a lovable car that I could rely on to break down. In fact, my real route into the heart of the classic car scene was hidden away in a barn in the Lake District, when several months after that incident, a lady who read my columns got in touch with me and asked me if I'd like to take an old car off her. Initially I thought it was an old Astra and I didn't take that much interest. When she mentioned it was an MGB, my mind got to work, thinking of excuses for me to jump in the car and go for a mysteriously unplanned trip to Cumbria. A week later, the old sports car had been loaded onto the back of a trailer for the long trip down the M6, and after a couple of months' hibernation at my dad's garage, it finally emerged last spring, and it's been going back and forth to classic car shows ever since. As a car, it's got a completely different character to the Minis and the hot hatches I'm used to. Whereas they're permanently fast-paced and frantic in everything they do, the low-slung B is a lazy, lusty old sports car, which likes nothing better than to burble down a country lane taking it easy. It can go fast, but it would really rather that you didn't. When the sun shines, even occasionally, choosing between it and my Mazda MX-5 is like picking either your left leg or your right leg. On the face of it, both of these cars do the same things for the same reason, but in reality they do them completely differently. I love them both. Driving the Mazda is a little bit like ordering a Bacardi Breezer on a night out. Depending on who you're with, it might be a little bit girly, but it's cheap and fun in a giggly, youthful sort of way. It's a 22-year-old and it behaves like one, with modern mechanicals, a cheap and simple soft top, and sprightly but not too scary handling, meaning the joys of driving one of those is accessible to just about everyone. But it's the MGB that gives me the bigger buzz. Driving it, in fact, doing anything with it, is like ordering a pint of Adnams Tally-Ho on a night out, which might mark you out as a bit of a bearded real ale enthusiast to the casual observer, but both of them have got an ineffable depth of character which the Alcopop just doesn't. It is a car which you describe not with figures and statistics, but with the carefully chosen phrases better known to an observer wine critic. Don't ask me why, but paradoxically I prefer the MG over the MX-5, even though it's slightly worse, which probably says a lot more about me than it does about either of the two cars. I've lost count of the exact number of cars I've driven over the past few years, but I reckon it's upwards of 100, and I reckon that, like with girls, there are certain things that'll draw me to one model over another. For starters, and I'm not being shallow, looks count for a lot. There is, in this day and age, no excuse for a car that's a bit of a minger, and while I'll also try and appreciate where a car is coming from, there's only so far you can go before you're put off completely by dodgy looks. The new 1 Series BMW, for instance, is by no means a bad car, but would you really drive around in something that looks like that? I'm sorry, but I just couldn't. You can forgive a car for being sculpted by someone who's had a bit of an off day, if there's substance beneath the style though, which is why, for instance, I'm such a big fan of Skoda's Yeti, Toyota's IQ and Hyundai's i30. If a car is packed with clever little touches and things that show where a bit of thought's gone into it, for me it presses all the right buttons. The same goes with price. I know we're in a recession at the moment, what makes the difference for me is not cheapness but value. An entry-level diesel 5 Series BMW will cost roughly the same, for instance, as an entry-level diesel Jaguar XF, but when you get in and drive the Jag, it's somehow just a little bit more special, which is why when you're paying nearly 30 grand it makes all the difference. If you're going to be living with it on a daily basis for the next 3 years, I reckon that's worth more than saving a couple of £100 when you're in the showroom. Quality, believe it or not, is still a big deal too. At roughly the same time that I drove the BMW and the Jag, I also managed to get a go in the Saab 9.5, one of the very last ones before the quirky Swedish company went bust. I liked its looks, its equipment levels and the comfort, but you could tell from the way it was put together that it just wasn't in the same league as the other two, and it was such a disappointment. Don't let anybody tell you that it's impossible to make a truly bad car in 2012. While there are plenty of cars that aren't as brilliant as you'd expect them to be, in terms of build quality and trim, some companies still do it far better than others. Just ask anybody who's driven the latest SsangYong Corando, for instance. But the one thing I look for more than anything else is what a car says to you when you're behind the wheel, because that's what separates the merely very good from the truly brilliant. I reckon I can tell whether a car's any good after about 300 yards of driving it, because it's immediately apparent in almost any vehicle whether it's up for a conversation with you, letting you know what's going on through the feeling coming in through the steering wheel and from the sound of the exhaust nose. For the past 2 years, for instance, I've had a Rover 200 parked outside my front window, and I really can't fault it. It's cheap, easy to live with, comfortable and endlessly reliable, and even looks quite good in a restrained, mature sort of way. But if I wanted to head out on a twisty country road on a wet, windy day, I'd pick a Ford Focus, because the Ford sparkles with information at roughly the same point that the Rover goes all numb in your fingers. Weirdly though, when I took the Rover all the way down to the Norfolk Broads, it actually made more sense than one particularly memorable day back in March this year, when I was entrusted with the task of making the exact same journey in a £60,000 supercar. The Lotus Evora S is not the fastest or the most expensive car that I've driven, but it'll always stand out in my motoring memories because it's the first time that anybody's been brave or stupid enough to hand me the keys to a really, truly quick car, even though I had to go all the way down to the factory in East Anglia to go and get it. It has a 3.5 litre V6 mounted in the middle, which thanks to being bolted to an enormous supercharger managed to churn out no less than 340 brake horsepower. And for 4 days, this glorious English bit of supercar engineering was all mine. So I loved every minute of it, I take it. Not really. It could outrun, outhandle and outbrake just about anything else for miles around, but while it treated me to a few undeniably brilliant moments, most of the time it was more frustrating than it was fantastic. It was, considering how little visibility you got, far too wide for modern Britain. It came with the immobiliser from hell, and 90% of the time you just couldn't use the incredible amount of firepower it had to offer. Worst of all, while the supercharger made it devastatingly quick, it all but destroyed the fuel economy. On a motorway run I was lucky to get 20 to the gallon. It was a stunning supercar, but I felt like a Burke driving it, not just because it wound other drivers up, but because I was broke by the time I pulled into that final petrol station on the long road back to Norfolk. If finding driving pleasure is a problem, supercars in this day and age really aren't the solution. In fact, if it's excitement you're looking for, you're much better off saving yourself £30,000 and squeezing yourself into the cramped confines of a Morgan three-wheeler, which I drove a couple of weeks after I handed the keys back to Lotus for the Evora. I've already mentioned that I try and avoid borrowing cars off dealerships, but with the Mad Morgan I made an exception, and I spent months hassling Life's Motors on West Street for a go in their demonstrator, simply because it looked like a cross between a blower Bentley and a fighter plane from the First World War. There are all sorts of reasons why you wouldn't buy one. It has no doors, no roof, no windscreen, and it costs about the same as a BMW 5 Series, but for the fun factor it's just off the scale. Wherever you went it drew a small crowd. The tuned bike engine stuck right on the front end made it marvellously and defiantly loud, and I suspect, having driven both, that the Morgan is more fun at 30 than the Lotus is at 130. It's proof that the feel and handling make for a more memorable motor than speed and power ever will. Yeah, there are plenty of cars which you can buy brand new in the showrooms today which for whatever reason just haven't made the grade when I've given them the road test treatments. The Toyota Prius, as much as I admire its green credentials, left me stone cold however I tried to drive it, and no matter how hard I tried to look past the 20 grand price tag, it always seemed a bit too much for the hybrid package that it offered. Audi's A1 on the other hand looked great from the outside, but it was too cramped, too expensive, and it had a ride so hard that it ought to come with its own personal osteopath. Hyundai's Veloster had the opposite problem. While it was by no means a bad car, in the style-conscious world of coupes it was completely outclassed by both the Volkswagen Scirocco and the Peugeot RCZ. But while I'll happily tell you about cars that I don't think are worth the outlay, at the pub I'm always asked the same question. There is, I think, only one way to answer it. In at number 10 is the Lotus Elise S, largely because it's sublime at doing all the things a really keen driver will ask of it. The Elise is a masterclass in feel, balance and handling. It's a pain to take to the supermarket, but it's unparalleled when it comes to tackling tricky mountain passes. Tough, roomy, reliable, affordable, enjoyable, refined and good looking. Quiet, well equipped, punchy, sure-footed and capable in the corners. The Skoda Yeti is all of these things and so much more, which is why I love it. A landmark car which turned the hatchback world upside down when it was launched, the original Ford Focus still ticks all the right boxes today. It's the first car that I'd recommend to anybody looking for a cheap second-hand buy. The first and so far only hybrid to truly win the petrolhead vote, the Honda CR-Z makes up for being a tight squeeze inside by being truly entertaining to drive. The Scirocco might be more practical, but if you don't need the rear seats, you should definitely get one of these. Endlessly entertaining, affordable, and you know it will never let you down. These are 3 reasons why the Mazda MX-5 is still the small sports car to beat. Does the latest version really need cruise control and Bluetooth though? It's cramped, it's unbelievably noisy, exposed, and it looks like something out of the Biggles books, which is exactly why I hold the Mad Morgan 3-wheeler in such high esteem. The world needs more cars like this one. I'm a big fan of the current Mazda MX-5, but the 1990 original is even better still, because it's lighter and it's better balanced. Delicate in more ways than one, but buy it carefully and it's a modern classic in the making. The Toyota IQ, on the other hand, is a packaging masterpiece packed with clever tech, 4 seats in the same space as the Smarts 2, a whizzy little engine and a setup giving it sure-footed handling. It is pricier than Igo, but I think it's worth every penny. A Ford Fiesta might be a better all-rounder, but for the things that matter to petrolheads, handling, feel, punch, that sort of thing, this, the Suzuki Swift Sport, is a genuinely great little car. Only one other machine beats it on the miles per pound basis that I use on Life on Cars. It's got a bouncy ride. It's got a tiny boot. It's badly made. It is far from being the perfect car, but it's done more in my books to change motoring than any other, and I love it because it's a petrolhead icon. There are all sorts of cars that make waves today, but for the Mini to have nailed the small car recipe as comprehensively as it did more than 50 years ago is an incredible accomplishment. It is still, out of all the cars I've driven, the one which corners the most immediately. It talks to you the most and it leaves you with the biggest smile. It's also completely classless, it never goes out of fashion, and it manages to squeeze 4 adults into an almost unimaginably small amount of metal. I love it because it works on so many different levels. It's a design classic, it's a go faster pocket rocket, it's a style icon, it's a go-kart, it's all of these things rolled into one. Almost as soon as I'd sold my first one, I ended up buying another, and even when I eventually sold that one, I still look longingly at a Mini when everyone passes me going the other direction. It is an epic car and I absolutely adore it. Just don't rely on one to get you anywhere.